Hey y'all, it's Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett. You may know me from my clapbacks against MAGA, extremist politicians like Marjorie Taylor Greene. But today, I'm asking you to clap back against the attacks on your rights and freedoms by getting out to vote this November. In 2022, Gen Z showed up at the polls at a higher rate than any generation had before in their first election. But I know y'all can do even better and outvote every generation that came before you. So next time you hit up the group chat, make sure everyone is registered and ready to vote. I'll see y'all at the polls.
Good evening, everyone.
Good evening.
Welcome to the Saving Democracy Together class for tonight. And first, let me begin by thanking Representative Jasmine Crockett, representative from Texas, for sending such a powerful statement to us and to our students to start off this week's class. We also welcome not just our participants in person, but our many participants online on Zoom. My name is Maurice Hall. I am provost here at Bennington College, and on behalf of the Center for the Advancement of Public Action at Bennington College, we welcome you tonight to our second session of Saving Democracy Together. Tonight's class is called Knowing History to Counteract Fake History. So it'll answer, as this class does, the question, why is it important to understand our history to preserve and strengthen the democracy? Well, tonight, Senator Brian Campion, who is the Director of Public Policy Programs here at CAPA, will introduce our guest, historian Dr. Casey Bohlen, and will moderate a conversation with our students and with all of you. I will be your online moderator for this evening. So please, on Zoom, as questions come up, feel free to enter them. We may not answer them immediately, but leave them there. We will get to them eventually. And if you have questions specifically for Dr. Bohlen as he speaks, as he presents, or comments, then that, for those of you on Zoom, is your preferred format to do that. There's a Q&A at the bottom of your screen. Please use that to enter your questions. And now, without further ado, I will turn it over to Senator Campion. Welcome him.
Thank you, Dr. Hall. Good evening, everyone. I am delighted to introduce and help moderate tonight's conversation. Really, those who are going to be front and center are our students who are going to be asking the questions, and they will introduce themselves as we get going. But for now, let me take a moment and introduce our very special guest, Professor Dr. Casey Bohlen. Dr. Bohlen is the Mellon Visiting Assistant Professor in History and Public Discourse at Smith College. He specializes in the history of religion and public life in the modern United States, with broader interests in the history of American social thought, capitalism, and political movements. He teaches widely in the field of modern U.S. history, offering surveys of American history since the Civil War and American religious history since the colonial era, as well as specialized courses in the history of religion and capitalism, U.S. intellectual history, and the history of American democracy from the Revolution to Trump. He is currently completing his first book, Prophetic Politics, which traces the rise and fall of a new social gospel in the post-1945 United States. Dr. Bohlen has a bachelor's degree from Brown University and a PhD from Harvard University. The one thing that I did not find on his website, which is the most important thing, I think, is that he has taught at Bennington College. So this truly is a welcome back. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Casey Bohlen.
Thank you, Brian, for that kind and warm welcome. You discovered that I scrubbed my Bennington Pass and corrected that fake history, so we're already off to a good start. Thanks, Brian. Thanks, Susan. Thanks to all of Kappa. Thanks to all of Bennington for the chance to speak with you all here today. My name is Casey Bohlen. I'm a professional historian, and I am here to speak with you about the dangers that fake history poses to our democratic life. Brian asked me to give a nice, light, tight 20-minute talk, but I've got to be honest, I got a little upset about the state of the world while I was writing these comments, and I haven't read them out loud to anybody except my cat, so I'm not totally sure how long I'll go on for. I hope it ends up being worth your time. Fake history, much like fake news, is a form of misinformation, or in some cases disinformation, a set of lies about our past that often serves a political or ideological purpose, typically circulates through unvetted information streams, social media, fringe podcasts, going viral, and in the process fragmenting the sense of community and the shared sense of reality upon which democratic life depends. But fake history is in many ways, I would argue, more dangerous than fake news. News is ephemeral. Tomorrow's falsehoods can be replaced with today's truths. History cuts deeper. Narratives about our past structure our sense of reality in fundamental ways. History is central to our sense of identity. We often define who we are as a person, as a people, as a community, as a nation, in terms of our understanding of who we have been. History endows us with a sense of purpose. When we set out to change the world, we are said to be making history. When holding the reins of power, the eyes of history are said to be upon us. What sort of history we imagine watching us and judging us matters terribly to how we handle those reins. And history shapes our visions of the future too. Our sense of what has been possible in the past sets limits on our sense of what can be possible in the future. Or sometimes our sense of how radically different the past has been can let loose our imaginings about how radically different the future can yet become. Those ideas can sound terribly abstract, so in the weeks leading up to this talk, I was hoping the news cycle right before it would kick up an anecdote or two I could use to illustrate. And unfortunately, although not unsurprisingly, the news cycle delivered. Just last week, you may have heard Tucker Carlson hosted a man named Daryl Cooper on his podcast. Cooper is a proud purveyor of fake history who specializes in being a Hitler apologist. He thinks that Americans have become too sanctimonious about their condemnations of Nazism and failed to see the past for what he thinks it was. In his fake version of this past, the intentional genocide of millions of Jews by the Nazi regime was a mere accident caused by the mismanagement of resources and otherwise benign detention camps. Winston Churchill, rather than Adolf Hitler, was, quote, primarily responsible for World War II becoming what it did. In his false past, according to one of his most inexplicable tweets, in which he posted a split screen with a picture of Nazi-occupied Paris on one side and a picture of one of the drag performances at this year's Summer Olympic opening ceremonies in the other, Nazi occupation, he said, is, quote, infinitely preferable to drag shows in virtually every way. Giving Daryl Cooper's fake history a platform, it is worth adding, that vice presidential candidate J.D. Vance has refused to condemn, a platform that Elon Musk, the world's richest man and current owner of our digital public square, elevated, retweeting the interview and calling it very interesting, is frightening, precisely because of the power of history. It does not take an overactive imagination to see how normalizing the fascist horrors of concentration camps could unravel the basis of a decades-long bipartisan horror at the Holocaust, and to simultaneously challenge the bipartisan commitment to anti-fascism, to preventing such an atrocity from ever happening again that rests upon that shared sense of horror. It does not take an overactive imagination to see the obvious and disturbing implications that unraveling could have for the present in a world where a major party candidate for US president, who just last year described immigrants as, quote, destroying the blood of our country, is currently proposing the use of mass detention camps as part of an effort to deport millions of families from American soil. If you tuned into Tuesday night's debate, you saw that same presidential candidate offering his own fantastically fake versions of history. Over the course of the evening, former President Trump claimed that the US currently has the worst inflation rate in history. As anybody who lived through the second half of the Carter administration will tell you, that is emphatically not true. He claimed that he presided over the greatest economy in the history of this country, again, by virtually every economic measure, not true even if you graciously exclude the catastrophic economic collapse of the final year of his administration. And he claimed that his campaign enjoys, quote, the biggest rallies, the most incredible rallies in the history of politics. I don't know exactly how to go about measuring the incredibleness of political rallies through the ages, but I feel pretty confident that one's fake history too. And although those lies may seem like minor sins in comparison to Holocaust denial, they too have real consequences. At a moment when the vast majority of voters rank the economy as their top concern heading into November's election, efforts to rewrite the history of that economy under the last two administrations could quite obviously have an impact on the election's outcome. And those are just the top fake history stories from the past week's news cycle. Fake histories, like all other forms of disinformation, seem to be flourishing lately, fueled by bad actors, by alternative media ecosystems, and just in case you wanted something else to be scared of, by the current ability of generative AI to convincingly deepfake the past. It's not great, but we do have at least one line of defense. The ranks of professional historians who work tirelessly to build a trustworthy, peer-reviewed historical record that can check and correct those lies. And it's been encouraging, I think, to see, despite the discipline's actually dismal enrollment numbers among undergraduates and colleges, it's been encouraging to nevertheless see how aggressively professional historians have worked lately to rush into the breach. Lately, historians have been flooding the opinion pages of major newspapers and journals with pieces that seek to correct the historical record on matters of vital public importance. They are publishing accessible books with fact-based narratives meant to counteract popular myths. They have aimed their writing at public audiences to a degree that I really can't remember happening before in my professional lifetime, and it's delightful. Just to give one example, two prolific Princeton historians, Kevin Kruse and Julian Zelizer, recently published a book called Myth America. It includes 20 exceptional essays by credentialed historians setting the record straight on popular myths, including essays that trace, for example, the histories of the New Deal and the Great Society, and show that they were not, in fact, major policy failures that prove the inadvisability of big government programs. An essay on the history of police violence, which shows that in moments of racial unrest, historically, police officers have far more often been the instigators of violence than the necessary response to it. An essay on the history of the slogan, America First, which reveals that it is not merely a neutral patriotic motto, but a loaded phrase with a long and sordid past, stretching back through fascist sympathizers in the 1940s, through the Ku Klux Klan of the 1920s, and originating in the nativist Know-Nothing Party of the 1850s. Myth America shot to the top of the New York Times bestseller list upon release, and it has received widespread coverage in the press, presumably giving those of us who are concerned about the spread of fake history some little bit of comfort. I was originally going to stop my talk there, but then I kept thinking. A dangerous pastime. The work these historians are doing to debunk fake histories is a wonderful thing, an exceptional public service, and I want to say that unreservedly, full stop. It is an absolutely necessary task. It is also, I think, not a sufficient one. It is not enough. Correcting the historical record with the facts is not enough. It is not enough because misinformation alone is not the reason that fake histories circulate. If merely correcting the record about the historic nature of President Trump's rally sizes was enough to diminish his appeal, he would long since have been vanquished from public life. People don't believe in fake histories because they don't know better. They don't believe in fake histories because they haven't amassed enough advanced degrees or because they read the wrong textbooks as children. They believe in them because those fake histories tell stories about the past. And those stories connect to other needs they have in the present. History is not merely a litany of facts arranged chronologically. It is not merely the objective record of what has transpired, laid out in sequential order. History is myth-making. It is the selective remembrance of those facts from the past. It is the arranging of those memories into a narrative that has power in the present. And fact-checking a few of those memories will not sap the narratives of their power on its own. Take, for example, the Trump administration's 1776 Commission. In 2020, towards the end of his term in office, Trump established a presidential commission and charged it with issuing a report that offered a more, quote, patriotic version of American history for educators, to combat the, quote, twisted web of lies students were supposedly being subjected to in their woke high school classrooms. Now, the commission's report had plenty of factual inaccuracies in it that historians could and did critique. It made some truly baffling decisions, including putting progressivism in a list next to communism, slavery, and fascism as a list of the historical threats to America's principles that should most concern students today. And then later including in its closing honor roll of, quote, timeless stories and noble heroes of American history, the song "This Land Is Your Land," which, if you don't know, was penned by Woody Guthrie, a man who was quite a few steps to the left of progressives, who was in fact writing regularly for a journal published by the Communist Party USA at the time he penned the song. The commission might have known that if a single professional historian was among its members. But there was no single professional historian among its members. It was staffed primarily by think tank hacks, and it sought to write American history bereft of the sort of factual expertise that Cruz and Zelizer offer in books like Myth America. But the power of the 1776 Commission had almost nothing to do with who was on its honor roll, with that level of factual detail. It was a response to Nicole Hannah-Jones' 1619 project, which famously argued that we should date the founding of this nation not to 1776 and the issuing of the US Declaration of Independence, but to 1619, when the first enslaved African was brought to these shores. The Trump administration did not object to the facts of Hannah-Jones's dating schema. It objected to its narrative implications. Kids today, Trump thundered in a speech on the matter delivered at Mount Rushmore, were becoming victims of a, quote, merciless campaign to defame our heroes, erase our values, and indoctrinate our children. They are being, quote, taught to hate their own country and believe that the men and women who built it were villains. The stated goal of the 1776 Commission was to tell a different story. One that taught, quote, every American child that they live in the greatest and most exceptional nation in the history of the world. That would make, quote, our children patriots who love their country. That would mine the raw facts of the past for a historical mythos in which America was always the good guy, always the hero. This too is fake history. And it too depends upon distortions of the historical record. But its power lay in parental fears about their children's sense of identity, rooted in their relationship to the American past, and no amount of op-eds citing peer-reviewed texts and archival sources are going to banish those fears. What we need to teach in our educational system, what we need in our democracy, if we hope to combat the scourge of fake history, is not just the ability to distinguish fact from fiction, but also the art of making new meaning out of those facts. When I sit down with my students each semester, we discuss certain historical realities that the 1776 Commission would prefer to look away from. The exploitation of Black labor and Black bodies from the cotton plantations of the South to the industrial workplaces of the North. The dispossession of indigenous lands by violence and disease that let this nation stretch from sea to shining sea. The shameful histories of Chinese exclusion and Japanese internment that marked a century of America First politics. But I do not invoke these realities to teach them to hate their country, or to love their country, for that matter. That is the work of the propagandist, not the historian. I invoke these realities, along with other realities, it is worth adding, declarations of the self-evident truth that all human beings are created equal, battles waged by ordinary people to widen the circle of citizenship, to claw dignity and liberty from the clutches of those who would deny it to them. I present them with all of these realities, and then I ask them, what story would you tell? How would you resolve the tensions and the paradoxes of our thorny past? What meaning would you wring out of these truths? I insist that they root their answer in fact. But I acknowledge that different arrangements of those facts, different emphases, can produce different narratives. And I try to teach them a skill that is absolutely essential to democratic citizenship, the skill of arranging those facts to make a meaning out of the past that is both true and powerful. We can perhaps think of efforts to resist fake history and save our democracy as a three-legged stool. One leg is the fact-checking, the essential job of academic historians to establish a basic sense of historical reality that we all can trust and from which we all can draw. A second leg is the critique, the rejection of narratives that are untrue, or partly true, or perhaps technically true in their component parts, but not worthy of a democratic people, not a story of the past by which we ought to be bound. And the third leg is the alternative narrative, the meaning that we seek to wring out of our collective past, the story that we believe we ought to tell about who we have been as we try to imagine who we can become. Perhaps an example will help to clothe that admittedly abstract idea in slightly more concrete terms. Since 2017, in the wake of the Charlottesville Unite the Right white supremacist rally, an estimated 175 Confederate statues have been removed from the public streets of this nation. Most were removed by local governments. Some were torn down by protesters who used ropes and chains to bring those granite giants to their knees. The Myth America collection offers an essay fact-checking the fake history of these statues, pointing out that they were erected not in the wake of Confederate surrender as some honorable means to heal a broken nation and honor the South's collective dead, some innocuous tribute to the lives of the recently fallen, which we are bound to respect. No, these Confederate statues were built a half-century later amidst the rise of Jim Crow, amidst a wave of Black disenfranchisement and mass lynching, as a way to solidify a fake historical narrative, as a means to cast free Black citizens into the shadow of statues that declared that the cause of the slaveholding South was not lost. That essay is the first leg of this stool, the essential first step of fact-checking, of providing context by which we can evaluate the narratives we have inherited. Also essential was the second leg of the stool, the resistance of the protesters, who pulled down the physical edifice of the narrative itself, who wrenched from the earth the embodiment of the white supremacist historical project, the living legacy of its selective remembrance of the past. The protesters did not just write viral essays noting that the history these statues stood for was untrue. They physically denied their continued power over us. They declared those narratives not worthy of our time. But there's the third leg of the stool. Most of those plinths now sit empty. The lights that once illuminated Robert E. Lee and Stonewall Jackson shining up into empty space. nothing hovering above their hulking bases but stars glittering in the night sky. The third leg of our stool is the answer to the question, what shall we raise into those spaces? A democratic citizenry needs to be equipped with the skills to tell facts from fiction. That is essential. We need to be capable of critical thought. We need to know which statues to tear down. But we need too to learn how to raise new statues in their place. How to make the telling of history more than just another exercise in propaganda. How to build a past capable of inspiring a worthy future. How to combat fake history, not with true history, but with better history. I think that is one of the surest ways to break through the entrenched inertia of our sclerotic present, to enable us to cast off the weight of unworthy traditions of generations past, and to open our collective eyes to new possibilities and a more democratic future. I'll leave things there.
Thank you so much, Dr. Bohlen. So let's get our conversation going. I have some questions. I know there may be questions that might come online. All of you have questions, but let's start with our students. Who would like to kick things off? Great. And I'm going to give you the mic, and again, introduce yourself and then ask your question.
Hi, I'm Olivia Flores. I'm from Chicago. I'm a first year here at Bennington, and I'm studying art history, most likely. You kind of touched on this in your speech, but basically being a part of Gen Z, I and countless other members of the generation have become aware of how generations before us have kind of failed at accurately depicting our country's past. And I just kind of wanted, could you elaborate on what those failed histories are, or the false histories are? And yeah.
Well, I mean, it sounds like you have some in mind, right? Are there any particular histories you're
I'd
thinking
say specifically like the founding, Christopher Columbus. Yeah, I see there's a movie with, it's Charlie Brown. And this is what I think of every time I think of false history. And it's them coming from the Mayflower, and all the Charlie Brown characters, they're coming on the Mayflower, and they're all friends with the indigenous people, and they just make it seem really positive. And it made like me have a more positive light on our country's past, but that was veiled because that's just not the truth. And so that's what I think about the founding a lot when I think about false histories.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's no question that the version of colonial, revolutionary, and constitutional history that I'm kind of curious whether your generation is really getting this anymore, but certainly the one I got, and probably the one that anybody with a little more gray hair on them than I currently have got, is one in which, you know, noble Puritans set sail for religious freedom, which is not correct, and then founded all of America, which like they were backwater, meaningless colonies relative to the mid-Atlantic and southern colonies. And of course got along peacefully with local indigenous communities who were so grateful for their advanced technology. And then all of a sudden they thought liberty for everybody would be a nice idea. And so they said goodbye to King George, and they embraced, you know, maybe we briefly mentioned the Articles of Confederation as like a pretty good first draft. And then they founded the most wonderful, free, beautiful, pure nation to have ever existed. And there's really just no part of that that's correct. It is a nationalistic history. It is precisely the sort of history the 1776 Commission was designed to produce, although actually theirs is slightly more nuanced than the version that I recall learning as a 6-year-old. One designed to stir patriotic feelings towards a past that never happened in the breasts of those who learn it. And I do think it's important not to, I find a lot of, are you Gen Z? I don't get the gens, right?
Yes.
I find a lot of Gen Z folks take that and then flip the coin on its head and say, well, it was all terrible. They were all horrible slave owners and rapists, and there is nothing good in this past worth salvaging, and what we ought to do is performatively post memes about how I wish I wasn't an American, but actually continue to reap the fruits of this nation's economy. And I think the truth is just infinitely more complex than any of those things. It is true that Thomas Jefferson was a rapist and a slave owner. It is true that George Washington took teeth out of the heads of his slaves to make his dentures. And it is also true that Thomas Jefferson wrote the soaring and eternal words of the Declaration of Independence. And it is true that Frederick Douglass used those words to help build a coalition dedicated to the emancipation of slaves. It is simultaneously true that Thomas Jefferson perpetuated the institution of slavery and wrote words that helped to ultimately set all enslaved persons within the boundaries of this nation free. And those things can both be true at the same time. And the question is, what emphasis do you lay on what parts of those narratives? How do you stitch those things together to make sense of them in a way that can bring you pride in your nation, in your community, in your past, instead of bringing you despair, without papering over the differences and giving you a false sense of exceptionalism that will only lead you to commit similar sins moving into the future? I don't know if that actually answered your question.
Oh, yeah, thank you.
There you have it.
And then my last question is, how can we, Gen Z, bridge the gap of learning between us and the generation after us, which is Generation Alpha, kind of a funny name and unfair also. How can we, yeah.
They get alpha, huh?
I think they're like 2014 to now, I think. How can we avoid making the same mistake as the generations before us and teach them about our country's past honestly while still leaving room for patriotic values to want to grow within them?
I have to be honest, I have no idea. I hope you figure out the answer. I mean, I really do think committing to educational reform and to building a robust history curriculum that tells honest truths without slipping into despair is essential. I referenced this sort of offhand in my speech, but the cratering of interest in historical education among American undergraduates right now is, I think, genuinely frightening. The total lack of interest in and curiosity about not just the United States past, that's what I'm expert in, so that's what I'm referring to, but just the past of human beings, of the planet, of the climate, generally, at a time when we need that sense of history more than ever is terrifying. The number of people who think, and I say this with all due respect to computer scientists, that a computer science degree is more valuable right now than a history degree, are making a very specific judgment about value. And our democracy needs people to make different judgments. You can get both degrees for the record if anybody is thinking about it. But we need an informed citizenry in order to prevent sliding into fascism, in order to defend the rights and liberties that are under direct and constant assault right now. And the feeling that a humanities degree broadly and a history degree specifically is not useful terrifies me. So I don't know how you talk to Generation Alpha, because I'm not sure you talk amongst yourselves. They're probably using even more advanced technology than TikTok right now, but ask them to take a history class. Tell them it's not just textbooks. Tell them it's not just, rote memorization for AP exams. Tell them that it is bringing to life our past and the connections between that past and our sense of selves in the present. And maybe we can educate a few more folks and try to build some bulwarks against this know-nothing approach to our history. Man, that was depressing. Thanks.
Thank you.
Jeez.
It's honest, it's okay.
Paige, do you want to jump in? Go ahead. Yeah. And then we'll get back to the table. Yeah.
I'm Paige. I'm a senior at Bennington.
Hello, Paige.
And my question is, I study philosophy, and I also have an interest in history education reform. So it's great to be speaking with you tonight. I've previously read Donald Yakoven's book, Teaching White Supremacy, which documents how white supremacy has basically been baked into our textbooks throughout American history. And so, one would think that school textbooks could be a trustworthy source. So my question is where should we get our history from? And you also just mentioned, history curriculum. Who do you think should be the ones that are making that curriculum?
Oh, this is an amazing question. to which I have really only vaguely amateurish answers. Obviously, for me, these textbooks should be broadly written by and based on the work of professional academic historians. I'm not at all surprised, to think that textbooks are not sources of reliable information. Some of the earliest myths, George Washington chopping down a cherry tree and all this, are from one of the original history textbook written by this guy named Weems, and it's just literally, it's filled with completely made up nonsense that was designed to be like a civics primer that sort of knit together the nation in the early national period when there were fears that there was no real American identity. Textbooks have long been a source of propaganda. Doesn't surprise me at all. There are very reputable textbooks that have been written by academic historians, but I'm actually really disinclined to say, like, you should just let the experts write the books. I'm not sure that's a terribly democratic approach. My impression, and here someone who's more closely tapped into the world of educators would probably have a better answer. My impression is that most educators feel like they don't have enough resources to teach the history they're assigned to teach well. That they haven't been given enough education, that they're not up to date with the latest literature, that they don't have enough professional development days, that they're not, getting paid to go to conferences and to keep up with the most recent literature. And so it is no surprise that they rely on whatever textbooks their districts bought. And it is no surprise that some of those textbooks will not measure up. Understanding teachers as more than babysitters, understanding them as folks who are forging the future of our nation would entail investing more in their professional development and ensuring that they are up to date so that you don't have to rely on my expertise, because that expertise is part of a broader ecosystem that filters down to the local level and ensures that students coming up from that level are neither getting textbooks that are 40 years old nor getting the 1776 project's version of history, but are getting a really robust, current, and up-to-date sense of the field as it's been made by scholarly folks like myself.
I'm Ollie. I'm a freshman. My question for you, is there a right or a correct way to incorporate current events into teaching history?
That's a great question. What do you think the answer is, Ollie? Like, why do you ask that question?
Well, I'm from Germany,
Oh.
so I have a whole thing prepared to read out about my experience. Like,
Would you start with that? I mean, I have some thoughts, but I'm curious about
yeah,
where
sure,
this is
I
coming
can.
from before.
Okay, oh God. Okay. Growing up in Germany, history is extremely prevalent. We are constantly reminded by our past, bad and good. In my experience, the Holocaust is very openly discussed in mainstream German society as an event that must never be repeated and that we must do our best to prevent anything remotely similar from ever happening again, with an emphasis on the we. Teachers in Germany are strongly discouraged from pushing a personal agenda and by custom are expected not to voice their opinion on any topic. I spent 6 months at a public school in North Carolina and this was not my experience at all. These guidelines are taken pretty seriously and students do complain if they feel as if a teacher violates the norms. If not many, most Germans whose ancestors lived in Germany during the time of the war are related to former Nazi Party members and people who fought for Germany during World War II. What I personally find to be fascinating is how history is taught by not applying the blame to us and our ancestors as individuals, but as a collective group of people. We are shown a variety of perspectives from that period of time and are never directly told what we should think about Nazis and the Holocaust. Instead, we engage with the topic through examples, facts, and debate. In school, this sometimes leads to uncomfortable and difficult conversations, but our teachers did their best to make it a safe space for us to have those conversations. This was especially important during the time I was in high school because Germany and Europe began to experience a rise in anti-migrant and anti-Semitic sentiment, and far-right political parties were voted into state and federal parliaments for the first time since the end of the war. At school, we were challenged to come to our own conclusions and develop an understanding of shared democratic values and responsibilities. Our school had Holocaust survivors come and speak about their own childhood experiences. In elementary school, we took field trips to memorialize concentration camps. We saw photos of mass graves of people who were murdered and learned about the social and political structures that led to the Holocaust. We learned how the Nazis and Hitler sold themselves to a nation suffering from economic and political turmoil on a platform of hate strategically targeted at Jews and people of Jewish descent. Learning about this part of my country's history is absolutely essential for my understanding of my country and its role in the world today. Even if I don't feel personally responsible or guilty for the atrocities that were committed at the time, I do feel responsible for ensuring that the horror of what happened never happens again, and I feel it is my duty as a citizen of my country to uphold strong democratic values and to hold our government accountable to serve the people. Yeah, sorry, that was it.
Ollie, thank you so much for sharing that. I think you probably should have been the one to give the talk. Can I ask you a question?
Sure.
What was your experience in North Carolina?
Well, like a lot of teachers were very, not directly like telling us, oh, like Trump is bad, like, you know, Biden's better, but there were definite like bias in the way they would discuss current events with us, especially with my history teacher. There were many times in the 6 months that I was there where, you know, something would come up in the news with Trump, something where people were like critical of him, and then she would somehow mock it or somehow talk about it in a negative space or joking way, and as if it was crazy and it didn't matter, which, you know, like in some cases wasn't totally wrong, but your history teacher is not the one who's supposed to be telling you that. And they're not supposed to be the ones telling you how to think, period.
So I hear you actually sort of talking about two different but related issues in your prepared comments and in your analysis of North Carolina. One is about what sorts of histories you are taught. And your account of what you learned in Germany was, I would suggest, a really robust, fact-based, but extraordinarily complex take on the past. It did not have an obvious moral lesson. It didn't have clear heroes and villains. It had a clear moral takeaway, but it attempted to understand what happened from a variety of perspectives with a wide range of evidence and without telling you in advance what the answer was. I imagine everybody here thinks, actually, that's a pretty good model. That certainly is the model that I strive for in terms of structuring the material that I offer in my history classes. And I think some of the best textbooks that I'm familiar with do something similar, where they present a wide range of primary source documents around a broad sort of chronological narrative in order to give you the tools to interpret the past on your own. That's sort of what I was trying to refer to in my talk as being a context in which I offer a wide range of perspectives in the past, and then I ask, what do you make of this? As for the sort of second half of your question, which is there a space for professors or high school history teachers to editorialize? It's a really hard question. I think it's actually a little more difficult than you gave it credit for, and I don't say that to criticize you. I say it to invite you into this conversation. It's one thing to just flippantly mock the perspectives of your students in a way that belittles them, that shuts down conversation, that does not acknowledge the legitimacy of diverse perspectives, that does not open up space for self-reflection if in fact they do have some sort of terrible idea. It's something that closes conversation instead of opens it. I do think there is space to acknowledge that we are human beings, that I am not some objective, all-knowing avatar of all scholars past, especially in contexts like Trump, who I would say most historians view as an existential threat to the values we hold dear. I think there's probably space to let that show. But I think the trick as an educator, and this is a very difficult line to walk, is to do so in a way that opens up conversation instead of shutting it down, in a way that invites students to reflect on their different perspectives and why they hold them, that invites them to criticize me for my perspectives, to acknowledge that we are all learning and we are all growing and we are all reevaluating our beliefs in the face of new facts, and that is something I can model better when you see who I am than when I pretend to be some sort of neutral person, you know, a sort of Wizard of Oz hiding behind a curtain. I try to do that by asking more questions than I answer. Talks like these actually make me extremely uncomfortable. I feel like I'm much better, I don't know if you've noticed in the Q&A, I'm much better at firing back with a question than I am with providing an answer to it, but that's in part because I think that's how you arrive at answers. I don't really much enjoy, Brian asked me to sit at the head of the table and I can't stop fidgeting because I don't like this. I don't like this. You're all looking at me. But as Ollie just showed us, you have as many answers to these questions as I do. Your knowledge may be different than my knowledge. It may be credentialed in a different way, but that doesn't make it less valuable. And I have as much to learn. If I could sit here for another 2 hours, well, my wife and kids wouldn't be happy, but if I could generally sit here for another 2 hours, we could learn so much from each other. So much more than if I have a mic in my hand and you take turns asking prepared questions and I just tell you what I think and we move on to the next one. So I don't know how much time we have, and I may be wasting some of it by continuing to follow up, but it's these exchanges. I mean, you now know how I feel about President Trump. But I hope you still feel that if you felt differently, we could talk about it. I don't know, maybe not. I would hope that someone who did feel differently would be willing to talk about it. And the more that we can replicate those kinds of spaces, physically, intellectually, the richer our democracy will be, because experts don't have all the answers that people do as well.
So we do have a large online presence as well, so we do have a question.
Yes, this question is, do you think that most scholars think Trump is an existential threat to our values, and that's put in quote, because objectively, most academics are left-leaning?
That is a tough question. I do think objectively, most academics, period, are left-leaning, and I'm not saying that as some sort of provocative statement. I'm saying virtually every study on the matter has shown that. I don't think that's because there's some, I'm not sure if the subtext of the question here is that there's some sort of like pervasive bias in the academy, then a conspiracy to keep out right-wing thinkers. I think let me put it this way. I think the idea of a left-right binary is ridiculously simplistic, and there is an extraordinary amount of political disagreement among academics around an infinite variety of matters, that in a two-party system where these are the only two choices, and one party has, since roughly the 1950s, tacked extremely hard to one corner of this binary, makes it look as though there is more conformity in academia than there is. I would add that Trump, as a general personality, and perhaps as a political strategy, has made a lot of hay out of describing academics as elites. This is something I think you have to do if you want to be a populist, but you are in fact a real estate magnate and billionaire. You need to have a set of elites to attack that are opposed to the people, and they can't be your corporate friends. Academics have historically, for wealthy corporate elites, been a convenient target. And I think it is unsurprising that many academics have responded to being the target of Trump's opprobrium by getting upset and opposing him. Those are the sort of crass reasons that academics might be generally opposed to Trump. But I really do think he is an existential threat to democracy. I mean, I think he has repeatedly, on camera, on the record, said things that are objectively anti-democratic. I think he was behind an insurrection in our nation's capital. And I think that Liz Cheney is planning to vote for Kamala Harris, and it's not because she's some pinko lefty. I think that there is a very clear case to be made to anybody who is listening that that is what Trump is. And whatever the particular politics of academic departments, and whatever the particular relationship between Trump and his, imaginary version of what makes an elite, that is a fact, and that probably explains more of the academy's attitude towards him than any of the other things.
Questions from any of you here? Yes, great.
So I'm Lori, I'm a freshman. I wanted to ask a question about nostalgia and its role in history. So I had a Latin tutor who told me that when she was doing all sorts of translation for undergrad, she would be reading a lot of Roman court documents, and throughout the centuries, there would always be someone saying, I miss the old Rome, and then you'd go 100 years back, and it would be, I miss the old Rome, and on and on and on. But so the theme of nostalgia, for a better time, is routine in history. I mean, it's seen there, it's seen now with Trump's administration. Make America Great Again, which is just, it's built on false history and a kind of general human tendency to romanticize the past. and just the general human tendency to be nostalgic. And I wanted to ask if this is a pattern you have noticed as well in terms of like general history, and how can people examine their own nostalgic tendencies in order to have a more realistic view of the past and apply that to their attitudes about what is going on today, or as you said, who we are, who we have been, and who we want to be.
Yeah. What was your name again? Lori. Lori. Fantastic question, Lori. All these freshmen with fantastic questions. Good work, Brian. Yeah, that's a tough one too. Okay, so here's what I'm gonna say. There are sort of two different things going on when people talk about nostalgia. One is like the personal nostalgia, where I'm like, I remember back when I was a youth running around Vermont and the evenings were cooler and now climate change has ruined my summers or whatever. And you know, these sorts of things I think are common and are probably human nature, and we tend to have a gauzy, romantic view of the past because our bodies are very good at forgetting trauma in order to continue to live, and what's left are all the good times. And then there's the politics of nostalgia. There's the effort to make a political or an ideological argument rooted in the idea of returning to a specific version of the past. And that is actually, I would say, not a universal thing in American politics in particular. There are exceptions to the really overly broad rule I'm about to propose. But beginning at least at the turn of the 20th century with the rise of the progressive era, the left in the United States has adopted a future-looking rhetoric, has really embraced the idea of progress as being essential to its identity. And you can see this a lot actually in the debate on Tuesday in the way that Vice President Harris kept saying things like, we're not going to go back. The ideological outlook of, I guess I should really say, mainstream liberals in the United States is really oriented towards the idea that things weren't great back then. Women couldn't vote, there was widespread disenfranchisement, there were immigration restrictions, and we can get rid of those things and make a better world. And by contrast, the conservative movement, linguistically looking to conserve things about the past, has tended to be very backwards looking. But generally speaking, I don't actually know that those like rhetorical devices map onto the actual politics especially well. The Reagan Revolution of the 80s, in the name of conserving a traditional past, unleashed, I mean, just like completely severed a very stable relationship between the state and markets in order to usher in a radical economic revolution that we now refer to as neoliberalism. And there was nothing conservative about that. It was not a return to some sort of thing that used to exist, certainly hadn't existed in the last 50 years. And similarly, when you think about what most liberals are talking, I mean, you know, Kamala kept saying we're not going to go back, but she was talking about literally restoring Roe. I mean, she's actually talking about going back to a legal regime that was established in 1973. Probably the biggest guiding light of the Biden administration right now is the FDR administration. And broadly speaking, I would suggest that American liberals right now look to the New Deal as a model. They just talk about going forward. And I can't help actually but wonder whether talking about preserving the best of the past might not serve them quite well, because actually the middle of the 20th century, when you think about the economy, when you think about labor, was a pretty good time in a lot of ways. And we could move forward in certain dimensions, racial, gendered politics, while returning in others, economy, a more robust relationship between the state and markets in order to preserve and protect the lives, the savings of ordinary Americans, and have a really productive political discourse that breaks out of this sort of trap of forward and back. I don't think that answered your question at all, Lori. But it just was occurring to me while I was talking, and thanks so much for giving me the opportunity to ramble about it.
We really are kind of getting close. We have about 7 minutes, so let's do another online and a couple others.
So we have two online questions. I'm going to try to see if I can combine them in some ways. Both are about the objectives of education. In one, do you think it would be better for education to teach multiple perspectives and stitched narratives that can help people see that while people do bad things, they are also capable of good things, even in times with different values? And similar to that, can you juxtapose political disagreement, as we see in the newspaper media, low-level class warfare, the undeclared oligarchs versus the rest of us, and how that maybe shifts the goals of education, discourse, and action?
Whew, I don't know if I can answer both of those questions together in a brief segment. Can you give me that first one more time, Maurice? I feel like I...
Sure. Do you think it would be better for education to teach
yes, the good, the bad,
multiple
the good, the bad,
perspectives,
the
the
good,
good
the bad,
people?
the good, the bad, and the ugly. Yeah. I kind of object to the premise of the question. I am not so sure thinking about the past in terms of good and bad is quite the right way to go about it. I think that it is important to present a robust and diverse set of perspectives on the past, and I think it is up to those interpreting it to think about what is good and worth keeping from it and what is bad and not. And I think part of that practice must involve the effort to empathetically understand the perspectives of people who are fundamentally unlike you, and to empathetically understand the perspectives of people that you find to be morally noxious. I taught a lesson earlier today on the rise of eugenics in the early 20th century. One of the first governments to institute mandatory sterilization laws, sterilizing the quote-unquote unfit, was Indiana. The United States was a pioneer in eugenical practice in efforts to rid the world of alcoholism and disease through ableist and racist and forcible sterilization of quote-unquote unfit populations. And this, I would say personally, is a bad thing. But offering you a history where I'm like, well, Indiana did some bad things, but also they invested in their public libraries, which is a good thing, doesn't teach us really anything about the past. It's a sort of vacuous both sidesism. What I instead ask students to do is to grapple with this painful past and then try to explain it. Why did people do this? Who did this? What ideas, beliefs, values led them to do this? How can we understand the popularization of those ideas and beliefs and values? How are they able to leverage that into policy, into law? How are we still living with the downstream consequences of those choices? Do we still see those beliefs and values circulating around us right now? That is my goal, not to condemn things as good or as bad, not to make sure I provide you with a little bit of good, leavened with a little bit of bad, so you don't get too optimistic about the future of the nation, but to offer you truths that you have to work to understand. Because those horrible things were done by ordinary people. And we could have done them if we had been in those shoes. And if we are to avoid doing those things, as Ali suggested, if we're to ensure that the travesties of the past are never repeated, we must understand why they happened in the first place. That, to me, is at the heart of a good history education.
Wrap it up. Final question. Final question.
Make it a good one.
Make it good. Come on.
Okay, we were just talking about tough question, and I feel I'm very passionate. I'm glad my advisor, the provost, and everybody's here. I'm a very passionate student when I ask question. I am Rodrigo, and I'm a senior, and I'm studying global politics here. When I was thinking about the question I want to ask you, because I know you know about history a lot, I use artificial intelligence to look for sources, and basically, I ask to the artificial intelligence, do you feel Donald Trump is a threat to democracy? And he said, yes. I asked the same question about Kamala Harris, and he said, no. But I'm a good researcher. And because I'm an immigrant, I'm not here to say love about Kamala Harris. I asked artificial intelligence if Kamala Harris keep people in prison incarcerated after the release date, and he said yes, where she was General Attorney of California. Also, let's take into account that we're talking about the current vice president of this country, the vice president of Joe Biden, whose administration has vetoed multiple times ceasefire agreements about terrible things that are going in the world that all of us are aware of. While this current administration were vetoing peace agreement, ceasefire, thousands of lives were lost. Hundreds and thousands of mothers and families were waiting for their hostages to be free. I feel this administration was not capable of getting a peace agreement, neither a ceasefire, and I don't even think we are close to it. And I feel very frustrated. I have to repeat that I'm an immigrant, I'm international. Thinking about Kamala Harris and Donald Trump, I don't feel that any of them will make me feel safe, especially after the debate. I would like to speak about the more than 60 million Latino immigrants of this country. And personally, I feel very unsafe and bad after all of this. My question is, have there been a time in the history of this country where we were facing two candidates that, from my point of view, are not the best qualified to be the next president of this country? And also, like, what is our role as young people to make sure that in the next election, hopefully during a democratic system, we can improve the quality of the candidates that we have? Sorry for saying I'm international, I'm not American, but hopefully, from the bottom of my heart, I hope there will be better candidates in the next election for this country. Thank you.
I'm so sorry. First, that sounds horrible. I do not have the answer, and the past does not have the answer. A two-party system is a really, really constrained system. A primary process that involves millions and millions of voters is not something that any gen, whatever their letters, can shift overnight. What I think history can show us is the power of movements to create change on the ground that makes life better for migrants, regardless of who sits in the Oval Office. That creates sanctuary spaces for families who are scared, that litigates against illegal and immoral and inhuman efforts to remove those people, and that fights for policy change little by little, bit by bit. Victories are not won overnight. Security is not guaranteed. The dustbin of history is littered with failure, but it is also filled with success. And the success starts with attempting in small ways to join local organizations that are committed to the cause in order to make the lives of people that you care about that much better one day and then the next. Enlisting folks with power in your cause, folks with money, folks with legal degrees, folks with organizing experience, folks with clerical collars, folks who can draw press, folks who can draw the attention of politicians, folks who can build coalitions, not folks who just focus on who's on the top of the ticket every 4 years. Because as important as that is, and it is extraordinarily important, particularly in the policy areas that you're pointing to, it's not enough. The presidents usually follow, they don't lead when it comes to questions like this. Blazing a path that both candidates feel compelled to follow is the only way to guarantee the safety of the folks that you're concerned about. I will admit that is a relatively uninformed perspective of somebody who studies the past more than changes the future, but that would be the lesson that I would take from the history of social movements.
Dr. Bohlen, thank you. We're not leaving yet because, as everyone knows, there are really two more final components to our evening. One of which has to do with from the field, where someone has either reached out to us or we reached out to someone else to talk about something that they're working on. And then after that, we always do, and Dr. Bohlen teed it up perfectly, a call to action. Last week, everyone will recall, as Susan Scorbati will talk about in just a moment, we had an introduction to BRAR's incredible website, to promote voter registration, and Susan will give us an update on that. But before we do that, everyone may recall last week we had about 10, 15 minutes with Alex, a Bennington alumna. If you would bring our additional guests up, Brian, that would be great. Alex is part of something called Move Texas, where she is, in short, on the ground registering young people to vote. Tonight, we have three people who are going to just say a few words, a little bit about what they're working on, and I'm also wondering if maybe Dr. Bohlen may have a word or two on this issue. We have with us Jim Ramsey, who is over there in the corner. We also have Bouquet Dimitrici with us. I know she's online. I think she has to speak in order to actually pop up. And then we also have with us Kelsey Adams. And one of the things I did when I was the chair of the education committee in Montpelier, I always said to my committee members when they were going on the floor to present a bill, I always told them the best way to present a bill and get it passed, what's the problem that you're trying to solve, and then give what you think is a good solution for it. So the problem that these three individuals are going to, I think, tell us about is that there are roughly 700,000 people living in Washington, D.C. right now. More than half are minorities, and they don't have representation, they don't have a vote in Congress. And so what we're going to do is we're going to hear from these three folks, and we're going to start with the two individuals zooming in. Are you there, Kayla? I know she's here. Bouquet, are you there?
I'm here.
Oh, great. Bouquet, how are you? It's great to see you again.
Good
Tell
evening.
us again, you're here at Bennington College, you're in DC, you yourself, but we're seeing you here up in Vermont. Tell us again a little bit about the problem that you're trying to solve down there.
Of course, absolutely. Thank you for having me. Again, my name is Bouquet Demirci. I'm the Director of Statehood in the Mayor's Executive Office. We are trying to push DC statehood. It's been obviously decades, as you all know, but I'll start with the biggest challenge and kind of go down the list. So let's start with the rallying cry of our nation's founders, taxation without representation. We are about 700,000 Americans who pay taxes, federal taxes, highest per capita actually, and we are denied full citizenship rights. We do not get representation in Congress. Again, federal taxes, we serve in the military, own juries, start businesses, families, we have communities here. This is not just monuments and museums. We contribute to our nation's economy in every way that every American does, but we do not get representation in Congress. So that's the biggest challenge, that's the biggest hurdle that we're fighting right now, as many, many others before us have. We are also a subject to the whims of federal government, where Congress interferes with our local laws and local funding and operations pretty consistently. Most recently, there was an act called the Bowser Act that was introduced by a Senator, Mike Lee from Utah, of all places, to repeal the DC home rule. So in addition to all of these, the limited home rule that we do have, that we enjoy, it is also subject to being taken at any moment. So this is a gist of what we are fighting for, what we're trying to do currently.
And if you don't mind, Dr. Bohlen, I'm just going to put you on the spot for a minute. Historically, can you say something about this, about DC and having a huge population but not having a vote in Congress? Well, I'd like to know. So other countries, this isn't the case, I'm told. other countries around the world, they actually, indeed, there's, their countries' capitals. You do have representatives in their national assemblies. Is there any historic reason why this isn't the case? I would love for you to tell us. Yeah. All right. Here we go. There you go, Jim.
Hi, everyone. Just how this all got started, I'll just give you three quick factoids. When the Constitution, we talked about the Constitution tonight, was signed, that was in 1787. A couple of key parts of that in Article 1, which defines the powers of Congress. One of the articles in there talks about establishing the seat of the federal government. Congress has the power to establish that. It also, somewhere in Article 1, which is quite vast, about half the Constitution, talks about calls the admissions clause. And we're going to hear from our guest speakers in D.C. talk a little bit about what does statehood mean and why would they be advocating for statehood. But the admissions clause, that also is under the control of Congress. So those are two very important points to keep in mind. Now, 1787. Well, last point. Who here has seen a musical called Hamilton? Anyone familiar with Hamilton? There's a wonderful song in there about the room where it happens. The room where it happens, that refers to in 1790, our very first Congress established something called the Residence Act. Now, this is after the fathers of the Constitution established this country. Presume that's, like I can say that. That when they established that at the time, then they decided 3 years later where the seat of government would be. It wasn't determined in the Constitution. It came with Congress 3 years later. And as we all learned from Hamilton, it was a deal cut by Alexander Hamilton and James Madison and Thomas Jefferson to have it, quote unquote, in the South, which turns out to be portions of lands from Maryland and Virginia. So that's how we kind of got started.
So this, again, is just an opportunity for us to learn from folks. These are folks in DC, not, who don't have representation in Congress. Tell us if we want to get involved and sort of help and work with you, what sorts of things would we do?
Is that Kelsey or Bouquet?
There you go, Kelsey, I think.
You go for it, Kelsey.
Hi, everybody. I'm Kelsey. I'm the director over at DC Vote. So always working in partnership with Bouquet over at the mayor's office. But DC Vote specifically is the advocacy, leading advocacy and only organization whose full-time responsibility is equality for DC. And our mission and vision for that looks like DC statehood. Just a little background. I know we did go across a few pointers, but I do want to point out 1776 and how DC came about. So in 1776, during when we were creating the Constitution, the Congress folks, they all met. So then they met once more in Philadelphia, and as we all know, the building was attacked. So what we saw on January 6th has already occurred. That was not the first time in history that the Capitol was insurrected, and that is what the formation of DC was about. So we created DC as a safe space for Congress to be able to convene, and a place where only the federal government would have control over that convening. So also, ironic to that, January 6th did occur and it was successful. So if we want to say that DC shouldn't be a state, when we go back to the moral and value of why DC was created, the country isn't doing its due justice to keep us safe. So at the end of the day, the best result would be DC statehood. In 1993, the DC statehood new constitution was created. And so the framework that was created in 1993 over time up until now is what we see today. That is what we present on the House floor, HR 51, which is the DC Admissions Act. The DC Admissions Act has passed twice through Congress, in which we know it has never passed through the Senate. And so current situation of DC statehood, it is a part of the 2025 voting rights package. So right now we're looking at 4 bills being coupled. That'll be the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act, the Native American Passage Act, DC statehood, and the Freedom to Vote Act. So the whole plan here is that day one, the new administration comes in, we're pushing all advocacy groups, all folks that really care about voting rights and true democracy for folks out here in America. They're going to all be pushing this voting rights package. Just on Tuesday, DC Vote participated in a lobby day with other national organizations, including the Leadership Council, League of Women Voters, and Black Voters Matter. So it was just a large coalition of folks on lobby day on Tuesday where we went to members of Congress to ensure that they will be pushing this voting rights package as it stands with all 4 bills day one in the new administration. So that is just paramount right now for what we're working through when we're thinking about pushing DC statehood and actually achieving it. What we know is that we need the members of Congress to pass HR 51 and then S 51 when it reaches the Senate. That'll be the way that we achieve DC statehood, will be through these specific bills. And that is the plan and mission of DC Vote, to push those bills. I do want to point out one more thing. DC's population is bigger than 2 states, and it's good to know that you guys are in Vermont, because it's Vermont and Wyoming. So we have more residents than you all, as well as Wyoming. Ironically enough, you guys have 2 votes in our nation's Congress, and we don't. So to us, that's just blasphemy. We're glad to be here, though, to express our concerns about this and hope that you guys will help us on our fight.
That was incredible. Thank you so much. We do have one question, and then we're going to close with Susan. There you go.
The question is, doesn't DC have 3 presidential electoral votes and a non-voting representative in Congress?
That is correct, but that is very problematic, and I can give you the best example. So the 118th Congress, which is the Congress that we have right now, they have successfully passed 8 disapproval resolutions. And I know you're thinking, what is a disapproval resolution? Well, you live in the state, so you don't suffer from this. So us folks out in DC, again, Congress has autonomy over DC. So our council that we elect, our mayor that we elect, decided to pass some laws in our favor. Congress stepped in and said, no, DC, that is not happening. And they overturned our laws. The biggest one being the revised criminal code. So if you guys were planning anything in the news, that was like a big conversation, not only locally, but nationally, because Congress used that as fuel for this election to expand on crime, and crime being a crisis. And let's be clear, crime is a crisis everywhere. So trying to overturn DC's laws when we elect folks that represent us, that express our concerns, is just extremely problematic. And I did want to share that disapproval resolutions and things of those natures are why we say a slogan, Congress needs to keep their hands off DC. So when we say hands off DC, we mean we create laws. When we have elected officials to pass them, those are the folks that we have entrusted to take care of us.
Kelsey and Bouquet, you both have got to come to Vermont next time and talk to us. Enough of this online stuff. You're incredible, but we do have one final question, and if you can be brief, that would be great.
To what extent do you think that voting rights are being obstructed for DC residents, because it would, for the time being, almost certainly ensure 2 additional Democratic seats in the Senate, and of course the Senate filibuster stands in the way? What's your response?
The brief response is DC statehood is racial justice. We know the makeup of DC is predominantly Black and brown, even though we're more like Mocha Latte now than Chocolate City. Check out Chocolate City. The author of that is Derek Musgrove, one of my board members. But back to the Mocha Latte that we're in now, we know statehood is racial justice. Yes, it would be 2 Democrats. And yes, we would be able to be a progressive country like we want to be. So that is the holdback, is the advancement of Black and brown people that a lot of folks out here in America don't want to see. I see y'all clapping. I can't hear it, but I feel good. I feel good. The
Yes,
person clapping makes me feel good.
And if I may add to that, Kelsey, that is not relative. It's not. It's up to the people of DC. It should not be the point. It should not even be discussed about DC statehood. It's about equality. It's about taxation without representation. And if
All right, we're going to have you two up here to debate this because you're both incredible. We thank you so much for being with us, and you're welcome to stick around, but we need to close our evening off with our director of the Center for the Advancement of Public Action, Susan Scribati.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Bohlen. Thank you, students. Thanks, people who are participating. Thank you for people online and for all of your questions and comments tonight. We really appreciate that. Before I kind of go to our call to action, so we'll put our slide up about that because we wanted that to be an important part of every week. I just was reflecting a little bit on everything we heard tonight and the fact that we very intentionally called this series Saving Democracy Together. So it is a commitment to, I think, the ideals and aspirations of a democracy and what that means even as we want to confront all the kind of harsh realities of our past and even what's going on in the present. But with all that said, I think there is a genuine, real desire for the things that make up a democracy. The fact that we can mediate differences, the premise of a democracy is diverse views that can be mediated, even though it's often not fair or equitable. But we want to hope that it could be, that free and fair elections are possible, that free speech is a right, that the rule of law can work and be just. So with all the imperfections, I think this commitment is really important. And as we heard from our international students last class, they have experienced what it means to have a democracy fail. And it's enormously painful and has lasting consequences where freedoms are really taken away. And we know that that's happening all over the world, and we don't want that to happen here. So with that said, our call to actions from last week, Abrar's website that he introduced to us, myballot.info, I have to report that in the last month, 80,000, no, the last week we're getting to the last week was 30,000. In the last couple weeks since Abrar launched this, 80,000 people have clicked onto the website. And I know for a fact that this is really spreading all over the United States now. Abrar reported today that in the last 7 days, 30,000 new people have, So we're hoping that that is turning into registering to vote. So I would just say to everybody online, everybody in here, we talked about last week, having those 10 people that you are speaking to and understanding that they have registered to vote and that they will talk to 10 other people who might not be registered, might not have decided yet. There's still some time, but to really understand how important it is that we really get out the vote, and particularly with Gen Z. We know on Abrar's website, no matter what state you click on, and it's very easy to click on any state in the country, at the top, Abrar has data that is very, reputable about how percentage of your generation voted in the last election. And I really believe it's like maybe 28% is the highest of all of your age group in a state voting. So we need to get it up to, from 28% to at least 70%. Yeah, it will make a huge difference in this election. It could mean the difference in how this election goes. So Abrar will keep us posted about how his website is going. But tonight we're coming to a different action that we want everybody to engage with, which is educate yourself about down ballot races. What does that mean? It means who are the people running for Senate in the state that you're voting in? Who are the people running for House of Representatives in the state you're voting in? Who are the people on your school board? Who is the mayor? Who's running for Secretary of State? These are often, as I think people we were discussing today, you get to a ballot, you look at it and you go, I don't really know a lot of these people or how to vote. So one thing that our students brought up this week was, let's all do our research. Let's really start to understand who is running in our communities, who is running in our states, and share that knowledge with others. And then lastly, go to your local journalists. Next week, we're going to focus on Gen Z, and we have a student journalist coming who covered the Columbia protests. And so there's a lot of local journalism going on in Vermont. We've got Vermont Digger, we've got the Bennington Banner, Times Union, the Burlington Free Press. So there are local magazines, newspapers, digital or otherwise, that will fill you in, and I'm sure that happens in every state. There's student journalists all over the country now that are covering races. So look to your student journalists and find out what's going on. So that's this week, to really pay attention and do your research about who's running in your state or where your friends are and how they want to vote. And then we'll get to our next call to action next week. So with that said, next week is called Gen Zers, Democracy and Building a Future Together. I spoke about one guest. Our other guest is Savante Myrick, who is currently the president for People for the American Way, the youngest mayor of Ithaca, New York, started out his political career very young, and we're excited to have him along with our students, again, who will be sitting around the table and asking questions. So with that, coffee, tea, cookies, please feel free to stick around. Thank you.